Today, I have the honour of speaking with Steve Gordon. And Steve is professor across 3 UCD schools, the School of Veterinary Medicine, the School of Medicine, and also the School of Biomolecular and Biomedical Science. And we will chat about tuberculosis, the forgotten pandemic. Hi, Stephen. How are you today? Oh, Steve, you're on mute. I'm not sure why. I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. That's yeah, fine. Thanks very much, Trish, for the invite. I'm delighted to be here.
You're very welcome. And first question for you today, as always, is where are you located, Stephen, and what's been keeping you sane during this lockdown?
Well, as you can probably tell, I'm at home here, as so many of us are. And yeah, in terms of what's been keeping me sane, I suppose daily walks with the family and dogs, although not on a day like today. So apart from that, maybe movie nights, a bit of escapism.
Absolutely. I think we're all in the same boat. Hopefully the weather will improve soon. So, Stephen, you are Professor of Veterinary Medicine at UCD. Can you please tell our audience about your research and what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Yeah, so my area of research since 1991 now has been tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infectious disease, mainly of the lungs, which infects humans, but also animals. And I suppose the common thread over the past 30 years that's kept me passionate about this is trying to use the new tools that we're developing in genetics and omics, try to understand how the bacteria that cause this disease in humans and animals actually go about infecting us, causing disease and transmitting to the next host, both on terms of the human pathogen, that's Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but also the animal pathogen Mycobacterium bovis.
Okay, and Steve, moving on to your title. So can you please tell us, it's a very intriguing title, so please tell us what you mean about TB, the forgotten pandemic.
Yes, I suppose whenever I talk to a lot of people, the usual taxi driver that I used to be in with, and I started to work on TB, they'd say, well, that's kind of solved, isn't it? And you could be forgiven for thinking that. We have a vaccine for tuberculosis, BCG. It's one of the most widely used vaccines in the world, 150 million doses given a year. We have antibiotics and drugs to treat TB, and yet TB is one of the largest infectious disease killers globally still. There's about 10 million new cases of active tuberculosis in humans, leading to about 1.5 million deaths a year. And sometimes getting those figures into your head is difficult. 1.5 million deaths roughly equates to a death every 20 to 25 seconds from a disease that we've known about since 1880s with Robert Koch, and for which we have a vaccine and drugs. So, and I think now as well with the Covid19 pandemic, what we're seeing is the transfer of resources away from control of TB towards control of obviously Covid19, which is needed. But because of that, case detection rates for TB are decreasing, and hence we're kind of going back in our ability to control TB in humans because of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure like you've raised a huge amount of points there, and I'm sure our audience will have lots of questions. So please do remember, submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So Steve, last question for you in our 5-minute chat. In UCD Discovery, we are very passionate about interdisciplinarity. So I'm just wondering, can you tell us, has interdisciplinarity been important in your work?
Yeah, well, that's huge. As I've just said, what I work on is, for the past 30 years, is tuberculosis in humans and animals. And because of that, that really speaks to the ideas of One Health. And One Health is a theme that's really getting more and more traction over the last number of years, which deals with the interaction between human, animal, and environmental health. And tuberculosis, in terms of the way that we've got infection in humans, but we've also got infections in animals. And that infection can move from animals to humans, so zoonotic transmission. And in trying to understand that, you really do need a vast array of expertise, not just me, who I always think of as I'm just a molecular bacteriologist. You need expertise from veterinarians, human medics, expertise in wildlife surveillance. So a huge amount of expertise that needs to be brought to bear on this issue to really try and make an impact in terms of disease control.
Fantastic, Steve. And we have questions flooding in for you. So I'm going to try and get through as many as possible. So what causes TB and where did it come from?
Okay, so that's a fantastic question. So tuberculosis, like I said, in humans, if we look at that, that's caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's a bacterial pathogen, one of the first bacterial pathogens that we've ever identified on the 24th of March, 1882 by Robert Koch, where he gave his presentation to the Berlin Physiological Society. Where it came from, you know, the ideas about the evolution of TB, if we go right back, we think that it evolved from a soil bacteria. The other bacteria that are related to Mycobacteria, the actinobacteria, are all usually soil bacteria, environmental bacteria. But along its evolutionary trajectory, Mycobacterium tuberculosis and the related bacteria that cause tuberculosis in animals seem to have evolved a way of infecting and transmitting over time. But that time scale is actually changing from year to year. Some people about 10 years ago would have said the most recent common ancestor was maybe 70,000 years ago. Newer ideas put the clock around 10,000 years on that, so very different.
Okay, and so huge amount of questions coming in about this, so I'm just going to kind of summarize them. In terms of the current pandemic, which we knew I think you knew you were going to get questions on this. So current similarities and differences between, I suppose, the TB pandemic, if you can call that, in the 1940s in Ireland and the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, again, that's a great question. I would say if we think about, again, the modern TB pandemic we're living through, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things I always tell students is that we can be tricked into thinking that pathogens or bacterial pathogens, don't discriminate between social status. If you get infected, so what? But in fact, that's the real lie in that. Poverty is the underlying driver in terms of infection, but also your outcome from infection. And we see that, we've known that for tuberculosis for decades, centuries even. If we look at some work that was actually published in 2018 that looked to see what would happen if we get rid of extreme poverty on the one hand, and also increase social access to universal health care, those two factors, if we could achieve them, would decrease TB incidence globally by 85%. And again, we know this from the way that tuberculosis death rates in the 20th century decreased across high-income countries. If we look at them, things are decreasing in track with improved living standards and access to public health and health access that was, although, really accelerated by the drugs that we developed in the 1940s and 50s, public health and increased living standards and access to health are what really helps us to combat tuberculosis. And it's the same for COVID-19 as well as obviously vaccines and therapeutics.
So these, if I'm right, these 10 new million people that are infected every year with TB, where are they? So obviously lower income countries, but where are we speaking about?
Yeah, so predominantly tuberculosis, if you look globally in terms of prevalence and incidence of TB, you're talking largely about Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific. But India in itself, just taking one country as an example, would be suffering from about 25% of all global TB cases. So it really is concentrated in low and middle income countries where access to health is substandard, really.
Yeah, and I'll throw in a quick question there in terms of, the incidence of COVID in these particular regions is high as well. Is there any kind of cross reactivity? I mean, they're both infecting the lungs.
Yeah, they're both lung diseases, so they're both causing that similar kind of attack on the lungs. But I think maybe the more common thread across them is, again, access to healthcare. So can we detect cases? Can we treat cases? Because by doing so, or by vaccinating, can we stop the transmission chain? That's the the overarching driver.
Okay,
And if we think about oh, sorry.
No, you're okay. No, go ahead. Keep going. Yeah.
No,
Just loads of questions coming in, and I want to try and get through them all.
I think this is, again, if you think about COVID-19, the discussions that are going on around, for example, the access to vaccines, again, it parallels a lot of what we've been dealing with for decades in tuberculosis. The fact, like I said, we do have, if we can detect cases and treat them, we can block that transmission chain of tuberculosis. And similarly, vaccines are going to be a huge help for COVID-19, but we need to get those vaccines globally to protect everybody, because we're not protected until we are all protected.
Actually, there's lots of really interesting questions coming around vaccines. So actually, here's a kind of controversial one. Were there any anti-vaxxers back when the TB vaccine was developed?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question as well, because again, one of the things, maybe I'll summarize this, because I could give another 15-minute talk about that. If we looked, for example, about the global use of the BCG vaccine, which really ramped up after the Second World War. If we look at the rollout of that vaccine in India, for example, just again as one case in point, there was an anti-vaccine movement, but it was more so around the idea that, again, to control TB, what you need to do is to improve access to healthcare generally. Poverty is what's driving this. And, simply layering in a vaccine on top of that, may not be enough. And that was a big debate that went on there. And I think that's a debate that we, really need to think about. So, the kind of anti-vaccine movement was there, but it was much more about the way that we think about trying to solve these issues, with tuberculosis being an example of that in terms of access to healthcare and in general. Okay,
we're running out of time, so we've got about kind of 4 minutes left. So I have lots of questions. We're going to try and speed our way through them, okay? So why is Ireland no longer administering the BCG vaccine to infants?
Well, yes, that's a good question. One of the reasons for that is down to global supply chains for BCG. There was an issue a few years ago about the actual production of the BCG vaccine. The BCG vaccine is a live vaccine. In fact, it's a weakened version of the bacteria, Mycobacterium bovis, that causes TB in animals. And again, that's another story as to why that is. But the incidence rates in Ireland are about 5 per 100,000. So, whether we should be, where should we be using these vaccines if they're in short supply? We know that BCG, while it offers differing levels of protection against pulmonary disease, it protects children very well against extrapulmonary and disseminated forms of TB. So that's why BCG is, through the WHO's EPI, the Advanced Program of Immunization, given to about 150 million children, neonates, to protect them against things like TB meningitis, for example. Okay, here's an interesting question for you. So many young people died in Ireland from a TB context. It's the Irish context. How did anyone in close contact survive it? Yeah, again, we could talk about this for a long time, but the way that the pathogen works, it's a chronic infection. So if you get infected with tuberculosis, you have a 5 to 10% lifetime risk of developing active TB. If we think globally, therefore, based on the numbers I've told you, we can see that globally, if we take the numbers of people who are infected, it's about 1/4 of the world's population who are infected with TB. And that leads every year to this 10 million new active disease cases. So you can be infected, but not necessarily progress to disease. And the things that do accelerate progression to disease are things like HIV co-infection, malnutrition, smoking, diabetes, these comorbidities that accelerate that process. So 2 very quick questions. One for you. That sounds like long COVID, and there's a lot of questions here about long COVID. So long TB, long COVID, maybe? Well, TB, again, it's an infection that can persist, over a very long period of time. It makes it difficult to think about how we could eradicate globally tuberculosis if it can persist latently inside us for decades. And again, only breaking down into active disease at a later date. It's an incredibly well-adapted pathogen to us in terms of its ability to infect and persist until the right moment to cause active disease and then transmit. So tuberculosis, again, like I've said, the weight of infection globally is enormous because of that.
Absolutely, and you say this, your title, last question, your title is kind of the forgotten pandemic. But here's a really interesting question to end with. Why is it so important not to forget pandemics?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to think about what we have experienced and what we are experiencing in terms of the mobilization of expertise and research to tackle COVID-19. And I think we need to remember what we're learning now and the way that we're all, to come back to your point about multidisciplinary research, we need to be able to sustain this, not only for the next pandemic, not only for TB, but other issues like antimicrobial resistance or things like climate change. All of these issues require multidisciplinary interactions and new ways of thinking to try to solve these problems. So it's critically important to remember what we're doing now, both in terms of how to address COVID-19, but in terms of much bigger things as well, like tuberculosis, but also climate change and other issues.
Music to our ears in discovery. Thank you so much, Steve. And unfortunately, we are completely out of time. So sincere apologies to all of those whose questions I did not get to. Just want to take this opportunity to say a huge thanks to Stephen. Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk today. Thank you.
Okay, well, take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for joining in. You can sign up to our series at zoomforthought.ie, where you can also check out our list of upcoming speakers. Thank you so much again, Steve, and have a great day, and see you all next week on Zoom for Thought. Thank you.
Take care.